The Alpha King caught the Omega training, his blind pup, but the truth left him speechless. "Step away from the boy, Omega." The Alpha King's voice was a low, guttural snarl that shook the frost from the ancient pine boughs. His golden eyes locked onto her, a lethal promise in the biting winter wind. Mila froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she did not cower. Instead, she stepped in front of the trembling, sightless pup, shielding his small, fragile frame with her own battered body. "He is not just a boy," she breathed, her voice steady despite the terrifying, crushing weight of his dominance pressing down on her lungs. "And if you truly are the king, you should know his scent. He is yours." The Alpha King froze, the lethal tension draining from his massive frame. The truth left him completely speechless. The world was nothing but white, and the agonizing ache of the cold. Deep within the jagged spine of the Blackwood Mountains, where the snowdrifts swallowed the trunks of centuries-old pines, Mila moved like a ghost. Her boots, wrapped in layers of scavenged, fraying canvas, made barely a whisper against the icy crust of the earth. She exhaled, her breath pluming into the frigid air like gray smoke. Her senses stretched so far she felt the vibration of a falling leaf miles away. "Again," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic rasp in the suffocating silence. A few feet away, a small figure shifted. It was a pup, no more than 6 winters old. He wore a heavy coat woven from rabbit pelts, far too large for his bony shoulders. In his small, blue-tinged hands, he gripped a whittled branch, the point sharpened against flat stones. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Where his eyes should have held the bright, fierce amber of his wolf lineage, there were only twin clouds of milky white, marred by a jagged silver scar that cut fiercely across the bridge of his nose. "Listen to the wind, Leo," Mila instructed, circling him slowly. She kept her footsteps feather-light, suppressing her own scent beneath the crushed pine needles and wild mint she had rubbed into her collarbones. "The wind is a liar. It carries scents from the past. You must listen for the heartbeat of the present, the break of the snow, the shift of weight." The boy's ears twitched a subtle, canine movement. He adjusted his stance, sinking his weight into his heels. Mila reached into her pocket, her frost-bitten fingers closing around a small, frozen pine cone. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it to his left. Snap, swish. Leo pivoted, his wooden spear striking out with shocking speed and precision, knocking the pine cone out of the air before it could touch the snow. Mila let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A bittersweet ache bloomed in her chest. He was learning. He was surviving, but the cost of that survival was etched into his sunken cheeks and the permanent tremor in his small hands. An Omega was not meant to train an Alpha. It went against the ancient laws of the realm. Omegas were the nurturers, the peacekeepers, the soft heart of a pack. They did not teach war, but war had come to them, blood-soaked and merciless, 5 years ago. Mila pushed the dark memories away. She couldn't afford the distraction. Not out here in the deep wilds, where rogue wolves and starved predators roamed. "Good," she murmured, stepping closer to brush the snow from his dark hair. "Very good, little wolf. Your reflexes are getting sharper." Leo leaned into her touch, his small nose twitching. "You smell like fear, Mila. And cold. You gave me your thickest skins. I run warm." She lied softly, though her lips were numb and her fingers ached with a persistent, gnawing pain. She pulled his hood up over his unseeing eyes. "We should head back to the den. The light is fading, and the shadows here have teeth." She turned to lead the way. But a sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere rooted her to the spot. The air didn't just grow colder. It grew heavy. It felt as though the atmospheric pressure had dropped instantly, pressing down on her shoulders, forcing the air from her lungs. The subtle sense of the forest, the damp earth, the sharp pine, the distant metallic tang of a frozen stream were instantly obliterated by a scent so powerful, so overwhelmingly dominant, that her knees buckled. It smelled like an oncoming storm, like ozone, crushed obsidian, and dark, ancient wood. Alpha, not just an alpha. The Alpha. Out of the whiteout blizzard conditions, massive silhouettes materialized. 4 of them, shifting from the forms of towering, monstrous wolves into men wrapped in heavy furs and black leather. But Mila didn't look at the guards. Her terrified gaze was anchored to the man in the center, King Scott. He was a myth made flesh, a ruler born of violence and crowned in tragedy. He stood well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders blocking out the meager winter light. His hair was as black as a starless night, falling in unruly waves over a face carved from granite, a harsh jawline, a straight, aristocratic nose, and eyes the color of liquid gold, burning with a lethal, predatory intensity. He had caught her scent, the scent of an unauthorized Omega in his forbidden hunting grounds. And worse, he had caught the scent of the pup. "Step away from the boy, Omega." Scott's voice was a low, guttural snarl that shook the frost. The opening hook played out a terrifying clash of wills. When Mila threw her fragile body in front of the blind pup, declaring his bloodline, the silence that followed was louder than a thunderclap. Scott stared at the boy. The heavy, lethal aura radiating from him faltered, fracturing like thin ice over a deep lake. He took a single, slow step forward, his golden eyes wide, locked onto the scar across the boy's face. The King of the North, the most feared shifter in a century, fell to his knees in the snow. The wind howled through the canopy, tossing dry snow into their faces, but beneath the ancient pines, time had stopped. Scott remained on his knees. The snow soaked through his dark leathers, but he didn't seem to feel the cold. His chest heaved, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts that misted heavily in the freezing air. The lethal, imposing monarch who had terrified entire territories was gone, replaced by a man staring at a ghost. "Julian?" Scott's voice cracked. It was a sound so raw, so filled with a devastating mixture of agony and impossible hope, that it made Mila's chest physically ache. The name hung in the air. Julian, the Crown Prince. The boy who was supposed to have burned to ashes in the ambush that claimed the king's mate 5 years ago. Behind Scott, his elite guards shifted uneasily, their hands drifting toward their broadswords. They smelled the truth, too. The underlying scent of pine and ozone, buried beneath the grime and the smell of the Omega. It was the king's bloodline. Unmistakable. Leo clutched the fabric of Mila's ragged coat, his knuckles white. The boy's milky eyes darted blindly, trying to track the source of the massive, overwhelming presence before him. "Mila?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "It's too heavy. It hurts to breathe." The pure alpha aura was suffocating the pup. Scott realized a fraction of a second later. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered at his temple. When he opened his eyes, the oppressive, crushing weight of his dominance vanished, pulled back tightly beneath his skin. He looked at Mila. Truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the frayed, dirt-stained canvas wrapped around her boots. He saw the way her thin, threadbare tunic offered no protection against the biting wind. He saw the purple bruises of exhaustion beneath her wide, defiant hazel eyes, and the jagged, half-healed scratch down her cheek. She was starving, freezing, and fundamentally broken by the elements. Yet, she stood before him, the king, with her chin raised, shielding his son like a wrathful goddess of the hearth. "How?" Scott demanded. The word was a harsh rasp, choked with emotion he was desperately trying to suppress. He rose slowly to his feet, towering over her once more. "I searched the ashes. I searched for months. They told me there were no survivors." Mila swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She kept her arms wrapped protectively around Leo's shoulders. "Because the ones who told you that were the ones who lit the fire. Your Grace." The reaction was instantaneous. A low, terrifying growl ripped from Scott's chest, vibrating through the ground. His guards tensed, eyes flashing amber as their wolves pushed the surface. "Treason!" One of the guards spat, stepping forward. "She lies. My king. An Omega from the outer fringes has no knowledge of the inner court." "Silence!" Scott roared, the command cracking like a whip. The guard instantly submitted, baring his neck. Scott's golden eyes snapped back to Mila. The fury in them was blinding, but she knew it wasn't directed at her. It was the fury of a father who realized his grief had been engineered. "Explain," Scott commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper. "I was a scullery maid in the summer palace," Mila began, her voice shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving her freezing and weak. "When the attack happened, I hid in the root cellar. I heard them, the beta of the Western Ridge and his men. They didn't want the queen dead. They only wanted the pup. They wanted to sever your bloodline so they could challenge your claim." Scott's fists clenched, the leather of his gloves creaking loudly in the quiet forest. "They found him," Mila continued, tears finally pricking her eyes, freezing almost instantly on her lashes. "They tried to kill him, but the queen, she fought them. She bought me enough time. I pulled him into the dumbwaiter. I dragged him through the servant tunnels, but one of their blades, it caught his eyes before we fell into the dark." Scott looked down at Leo. He reached out a massive, trembling hand, stopping mere inches from the boy's scarred face. He didn't touch him, afraid his rough hands would break the fragile reality before him. "You took him into the deep wilds," Scott said, his voice laced with disbelief. "You braved the winter, the rogues, the starvation, to protect a pup that wasn't yours." "He was innocent," Mila whispered fiercely, her protective instincts overriding her fear of the Alpha. "And he is Pack. Omegas do not abandon pups. Not ever." A strange, intense emotion flickered in Scott's golden eyes. It was a look that made Mila's breath catch, sending a sudden, confusing jolt of warmth straight down to her toes. The space between them seemed to shrink, the wind died down, and for a fleeting second, the scent of his ozone and dark pine wrapped around her own scent of wild mint, tangling together in the freezing air. "My king," the lead guard interrupted cautiously. "We are exposed here. If the Western Beta's spies track our patrol..." Scott's gaze didn't leave Mila's face. The harsh lines of his face softened, just a fraction, revealing the exhausted, grieving man beneath the crown. "Take off your cloak, KL," Scott ordered his guard, never breaking eye contact with the Omega. The guard didn't hesitate. He unclasped the heavy, fur-lined mantle and handed it to the king. Scott stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Mila stiffened, preparing to be pushed aside. Instead, Scott draped the massive, obscenely warm cloak over Mila's shivering shoulders. The residual heat from the garment, laced deeply with the king's intoxicating scent, enveloped her like an embrace. She gasped softly at the sudden warmth. Without a word, Scott knelt in the snow again. This time, he gently scooped the blind pup into his massive arms. Leo stiffened, letting out a small whimper of fear, but Scott merely tucked the boy's head against his broad chest, right over his heart. "Listen to the heartbeat, little wolf," Scott murmured, his voice incredibly gentle. "You are safe now." Scott stood, holding his son with the fierce, possessive grip of a dragon guarding its only treasure. He looked back at Mila, who stood completely stunned, swallowed by his giant cloak. "Lead us to your den, Omega," Scott said, the command devoid of its previous edge. "Tonight, we hide in the shadows. Tomorrow, I burn the Western Ridge to the ground." The den was little more than a hollowed-out cavern beneath the tangled roots of a massive, fallen oak, cleverly concealed by a thick weave of dead brambles and packed snow. It was cramped, smelled heavily of damp earth and dried herbs, and was entirely unsuitable for a king. Yet, Scott entered without hesitation, ducking his head beneath the low earthen ceiling. Inside, a meager fire smoldered in a ring of blackened stones. Mila immediately went to it, her frozen fingers clumsily feeding dry twigs and moss into the embers. Within moments, the golden glow of firelight danced across the cavern walls, pushing back the oppressive darkness. Scott gently set Leo down onto a pile of woven pine needles and rabbit furs, the only soft surface in the cave. The boy immediately curled into a tight ball, his face pressed into the furs, exhausted by the emotional and physical toll of the day. Within minutes, the steady, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep filled the small space. The king's guards remained outside, fanning out into the blizzard to secure a perimeter. It left Scott and Mila alone in the suffocatingly small den. Mila sat back on her heels across the fire from him. The heavy fur cloak he had given her was pooled around her, retaining a heat she hadn't felt in 5 years. Now that the adrenaline had completely faded, her body began to betray her. A deep, violent shiver racked her frame, her teeth chattering so hard it echoed in the quiet cave. Scott watched her through the dancing flames. His golden eyes tracked every tremor of her fragile body, every smudge of dirt on her pale skin. He was a creature of immense power, used to subjects averting their eyes, used to the absolute obedience of the pack. But this Omega, this tiny, half-starved woman had looked him in the eye and defied him to protect his blood. He moved suddenly, shifting around the fire pit. Mila flinched, instinctively pulling her knees to her chest, but Scott only reached out, taking her trembling, frost-bitten hands into his massive, calloused palms. "You're freezing to death," he murmured. The timbre of his voice was deep, rumbling in his chest like distant thunder. "I'm fine," she lied automatically, though her fingers felt like shards of glass within his warm grip. "You lie poorly, little bird," Scott replied softly. He didn't let go. Instead, he began to rub her hands, his thumbs tracing slow, deliberate circles over her bruised knuckles, generating friction and heat. Mila couldn't breathe. The proximity was intoxicating. He was so close she could see the individual gold flecks in his irises, could see the shadow of stubble along his sharp jawline. His scent wood smoke, pine, and pure, concentrated alpha was short-circuiting her mind. Omegas were wired to seek out alpha strength, to crave the safety of their protection. But Mila had spent 5 years suppressing those instincts, surviving on pure grit alone. Now, having the most powerful alpha in the realm tenderly warming her hands, her carefully constructed walls began to crumble. "Why did you not come to the Citadel?" Scott asked, his voice a low, mesmerizing hum. "If you knew the Western Beta was the traitor, why didn't you bring the boy to me?" Mila looked down at their joined hands. The contrast between his dark, scarred skin and her pale, bruised fingers was stark. Who would have let me in? An Omega in rags, claiming the dead prince was alive? They would have slaughtered me at the gates. The Beta's spies are everywhere. I couldn't risk Leo. I couldn't risk your son. Scott's grip tightened slightly, a surge of dark emotion crossing his face. You sacrificed your life. You lived like a ghost in the ice, starving yourself so he could eat. He was the only light I had left, Mila whispered, a single tear escaping, tracking through the soot on her cheek. Before she could wipe it away, Scott released one of her hands. He reached up, his rough thumb gently brushing the tear from her skin. The contact sent a violent shockwave of electricity straight to Mila's core. Her breath hitched, her hazel eyes flying up to meet his. Scott went completely still. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the gold until his eyes were nearly black. The air in the cavern suddenly felt incredibly thin, heavy with a sudden, suffocating heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Mate. The word wasn't spoken, but it vibrated through the earth, through the smoke, right into the marrow of their bones. It was a terrifying, impossible realization. The Alpha King, bound by royal bloodlines and political alliances, and a nameless, outcast Omega, the laws of the pack strictly forbade it. An Alpha King required a Luna of equal standing, a warrior queen to rule the brutal north. Scott's chest rose and fell rapidly. He looked at her lips, then up to her eyes, fighting a sudden, feral urge to pull her into his lap and bury his face in her neck, to inhale the scent of wild mint until it drowned out the rest of the world. Mila pulled back, her heart hammering wildly. The terror in her eyes mirrored his own internal war. Suddenly, a sharp, unnatural snap echoed from the woods outside the cave. It wasn't the heavy, deliberate tread of the king's guards. It was the stealthy, calculated snap of a hunter trying to mask their approach. Scott's head snapped toward the entrance of the den. The tender, confused man, vanishing instantly, replaced by the lethal predator. His eyes glowed a bright, unnatural gold in the dim light. "Stay behind me," he growled, pulling a long, wicked hunting knife from his boot as a shadow fell across the entrance of the cave. The shadow stretched, detaching itself from the biting white glare of the blizzard outside. It wasn't a man, nor was it fully a wolf. It was something caught in the grotesque middle ground, a half-shifted rogue, its spine hunched, heavy claws extending from scarred, dirt-caked fingers. Its eyes glowed a sickly, infected yellow, entirely devoid of reason. An assassin. Scott didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that defied his massive bulk. The heavy hunting knife in his hand became a silver blur in the dim firelight. Mila threw herself backward, curling her entire body over Leo. The boy woke with a sharp gasp, a thin, terrified sound rising in his throat. But Mila pressed a cold, trembling hand gently over his mouth, burying his face deeper into the rabbit furs. She squeezed her eyes shut, her other hand blindly gripping a thick piece of firewood. Thwack! The sound of steel biting through thick muscle and bone was sickeningly loud in the cramped space. A hot spray of crimson hit the dirt wall just inches from Mila's shoulder, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. The rogue choked, a gurgling, wet snarl escaping its throat before it collapsed backward, its massive weight shaking the cavern floor as Scott drove the blade home. But the silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat. A cacophony of snarls erupted outside. The blizzard itself seemed to be alive with them. "Kale! Form the line!" Scott's voice roared, a thunderous command that vibrated in Mila's chest, cutting through the howling wind. He wrenched his blade free and glanced back at Mila. The tender, conflicted king who had wiped away her tear was completely gone. In his place was the apex predator of the north. His golden eyes burned with an otherworldly, lethal fire. "Do not move from this spot," Scott commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "If anything enters this den that isn't me, you kill it. Do you understand?" Mila swallowed the lump of sheer terror in her throat and nodded, her grip tightening on the heavy piece of firewood. "Yes." Scott spun and lunged out of the den, throwing himself into the storm. Instantly, the sounds of a brutal skirmish filled the air, the heavy clash of steel, the sickening crunch of bone, the deep, chest-rattling snarls of fully shifted alpha guards fighting for their king. Mila stayed perfectly still, her body acting as a human shield for the trembling prince beneath her. Leo's small hands gripped her tunic so tightly she could feel his knuckles digging into her ribs. "I'm here, little wolf," she whispered into his dark hair, keeping her voice steady despite the chaotic bloodbath unfolding just yards away. "Focus on my heartbeat. Not the noise, just my heartbeat." Suddenly, the packed dirt ceiling of the den groaned. Dust and snow showered down over the fire pit, causing the flames to hiss and spit. Mila looked up just as the thick weave of dead brambles forming the roof caved in. A second rogue dropped into the cave, a monstrous weight of matted gray fur and feral muscle. It landed heavily on the smoldering embers of the fire, letting out a shriek of pain as the coals burned its feet. The beast thrashed, its frenzied, jaundiced eyes locking onto the easiest prey in the room, the huddled Omega and the pup. It lunged. Mila didn't think. Instinct, honed by 5 years of brutal survival in the deep wilds, took over. She shoved Leo roughly aside into the darkest corner of the roots and swung her piece of firewood with everything she had. The heavy wood connected with the side of the rogue's snout with a loud crack. The beast yelped, its jaw snapping sideways, but the blow wasn't enough to stop its momentum. A massive, clawed hand backhanded Mila across the chest. The force lifted her off her feet, sending her slamming hard against the earthen wall. All the air rushed from her lungs. Black spots danced violently in her vision, and a sharp, blinding pain radiated from her ribs. The rogue loomed over her, its jaws parting to reveal rows of jagged, yellowed teeth, hot breath washing over her face. Mila scrambled backward, her fingers desperately clawing at the dirt, searching for a weapon, a rock, anything. Before the beast could sink its teeth into her throat, a massive, pure black shadow tore through the ruined entrance of the den. It was a wolf the size of a warhorse. Its fur was as dark as midnight, rippling over mountains of coiled muscle. The king had shifted. Scott's wolf didn't just attack the rogue, he obliterated it. His massive jaws clamped shut around the rogue's neck with the devastating force of a steel trap. A singular, horrifying crunch echoed through the cave, and the rogue went completely limp. Scott tossed the massive body aside as if it weighed nothing more than a rag doll. The enormous black wolf whirled around, his golden eyes wide and frantic, locking onto Mila. He stalked toward her, his chest heaving, his muzzle stained with dark blood. Mila pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. A primal, instinctual fear urged her to bare her neck, to submit to the overwhelming alpha dominance radiating from him. But as Scott lowered his massive head, he didn't demand submission. He nudged his cold, wet nose gently against her cheek, inhaling her scent deeply. A low, rumbling whine vibrated in his chest, a sound of pure, agonizing relief. "You are safe," the sound seemed to say. "I have you." Mila reached up with a trembling hand, her fingers burying into the thick, coarse fur at the nape of his neck. The mate bond flared again, a brilliant, terrifying spark in the dark. Outside, the sounds of fighting ceased, replaced by the heavy panting of the surviving guards. The den was destroyed, the fire extinguished, the roof caved in. Their sanctuary was gone. Scott pulled back, giving her face one last, lingering nudge before shifting his attention to the corner where Leo remained curled into a tight, silent ball. The massive wolf gently clamped his jaws around the thick collar of the boy's rabbit fur coat, lifting the blind prince as delicately as a mother wolf carrying her newborn. Scott turned toward the exit and looked back at Mila. His golden eyes were urgent. The message was clear. They could not stay. The hunt had found them, and the deep wilds were no longer safe. The journey through the blizzard was a hallucinatory blur of biting cold and immense, suffocating heat. Mila rode on Scott's back. To survive the lethal drop in temperature, she was forced to flatten herself entirely against his massive wolf form, burying her freezing face into the thick, coarse fur behind his ears. Beneath her, she could feel the terrifying, rhythmic power of his muscles working the flex and extension of an apex predator devouring the miles. Leo was secured ahead of her, nestled between her arms and Scott's broad shoulders, shielded entirely from the wind by Mila's body and the king's heavy cloak. They ran for hours. The deep snow that would have trapped a human merely parted around the king's massive paws. Kale and the remaining guards flanked them, forming an impenetrable, shifting wall of muscle and teeth. No other rogues dared approach. The scent of an enraged, bloodied Alpha King was enough to clear the forest for miles. By the time the terrain began to slope violently upward, Mila's limbs were entirely numb. The howling wind had stolen the last of her energy. She kept her eyes shut, concentrating solely on the thrumming, steady heartbeat pounding against her chest. Scott's heartbeat. "Hold fast," a gruff voice echoed over the wind. Kale had shifted back to his human form, wading through waist-deep snow. Mila forced her heavy eyelids open. They had cleared the tree line. Looming before them, carved directly into the sheer, unforgiving face of the mountain, was a structure that defied reason. It wasn't a castle. It was a scar of black stone rising into the storm clouds. Massive iron gates, rusted by centuries of ice, stood sealed shut against the elements. Windspire, the ancient, ancestral safehold of the first Alpha Kings. Scott let out a low, commanding growl. He didn't slow his pace. As they approached the towering gates, Mila braced for impact, but the heavy iron groaned and miraculously began to grind open, triggered by the ancient blood magic recognizing its true master. They slipped inside just as the blizzard reached a fever pitch, the iron gates slamming shut behind them with a deafening, final boom. The sudden silence was shocking. They were in a cavernous courtyard, sheltered by vaulted stone ceilings. Torches in iron sconces flickered to life along the walls, reacting to the king's presence. Scott knelt, allowing Mila to slide off his back. Her legs immediately gave out. She hit the stone floor, her knees taking the brunt of the impact, too frozen to support her own weight. Instantly, Scott shifted back. The massive black wolf vanished, replaced by the towering, imposing figure of the king. He was entirely bare-chested, his skin flushed with the unnatural heat of the shift, his dark hair wild and dusted with melting snow. He didn't bother reaching for the spare clothes Kale offered. Instead, he dropped to his knees beside Mila, his golden eyes scanning her pale face. "You're injured," he stated, his voice a rough, gravelly rasp. He reached out, his warm fingers ghosting over her ribs where the rogue had struck her. Mila flinched, a sharp hiss escaping her lips. Just bruised. I've had worse. Scott's jaw tightened, a dangerous shadow crossing his face at the thought of what worse meant for her out in the wild. He turned his attention to Leo, who was standing frozen, his milky eyes wide and unseeing, utterly overwhelmed by the echoes of the massive stone fortress. "Kale," Scott ordered, not looking away from Mila. "Take the prince to the inner hearth. Warm him. Feed him whatever provisions remain in the deep stores." Kale bowed deeply, an action of pure reverence. He approached the boy gently. "Come, little prince. The fire is waiting." Leo hesitated, turning his blind gaze toward where he heard Mila's unsteady breathing. "Mila? Go with him, Leo." Mila forced her voice to sound strong, though her teeth chattered. "I am right behind you." As the guard led the boy away, Scott reached down and, without a word of warning, scooped Mila into his arms. She gasped, her hands instinctively flying to his bare shoulders to steady herself. His skin was burning hot, radiating a fierce, comforting heat that immediately began to thaw the ice in her bones. "I can walk," she protested weakly, though she made no move to escape his hold. "You cannot," Scott replied simply. He carried her out of the courtyard and up a sweeping, spiraling staircase carved from black obsidian. The intimacy of his hold was overwhelming. Her cheek was pressed against his bare chest, right over his heart. She could smell the ozone, the dark pine, and the faint, coppery scent of the blood he had spilled to protect them. She was hyper-aware of the corded muscle of his arms supporting her weight as if she were made of glass. He didn't take her to the communal hearth. Instead, he carried her to a set of heavy oaken doors at the top of the highest tower, the king's private chambers. He kicked the doors open. The room was immense, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that roared to life the moment he crossed the threshold. He set her down gently on a vast bed draped in thick, luxurious furs, a stark contrast to the dirt and pine needles she had slept on for 5 years. Scott finally pulled a linen shirt over his head, though it did little to hide the intimidating breadth of his shoulders. He walked to the fire, staring into the flames. The lethal warrior had receded, leaving behind a man carrying the weight of a fractured kingdom. "The beta of the Western Ridge knows the boy is alive," Scott said quietly, his back to her. "Those rogues were not a random pack. They were hired knives. They tracked your scent." Mila pulled the furs around her shoulders, the pain in her ribs throbbing dull and heavy. "Then you must leave us here. Gather your armies. Secure your throne." Scott turned around slowly, his golden eyes locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that made the air in the room feel hedgy and thick. "I spent 5 years believing my mate and my son were ashes," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silken whisper. He walked toward the bed, stopping just inches from her knees. "I will burn the West to the ground for their treason, but you are mistaken if you think I will ever leave you behind again." The mate bond pulsed violently between them, a physical tether that yanked the breath from her lungs. She stared up at him, trapped in the gravitational pull of the Alpha King. "I am an Omega," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I do not belong in a king's court." Scott reached down, his rough thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, sending a shockwave of heat straight to her core. "You belong to me," he murmured, a vow carved in stone and shadow. The firelight threw long, flickering shadows across the obsidian walls of the king's chambers. Mila sat frozen under Scott's touch, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. "You belong to me." The words echoed in the quiet room, a terrifying, possessive claim that shattered the careful armor she had built over 5 brutal years. Omegas were taught to yield, to lower their eyes and expose their throats to alpha authority. But Mila had survived the deep wilds by forgetting how to yield. She forced herself to look away, breaking the magnetic hold of his golden eyes. She gently pushed his hand away from her jaw. Her fingers lingered against his warm skin for a fraction of a second, longer than necessary, a betrayal of her own instincts. "I belong to no one. Your Grace," she said, her voice unsteady but resolute. "I protected the prince because it was right, not to be claimed as a spoil of war." Scott didn't pull away entirely. He let his hand drop, resting his knuckles against the thick furs beside her hip, a muscle feathered in his tight jaw. The alpha inside him roared at the rejection, demanding he assert his dominance, demanding he prove the undeniable mate bond pulsing between them. But Scott wrestled the beast down. He saw the genuine terror flashing in her hazel eyes, not fear of his anger, but fear of losing the hard-won freedom she had bled for in the snow. "You misunderstand my claim, Mila," he said quietly, the gravel in his voice softening. It was the first time he had spoken her name. Hearing it roll off his tongue sent a flush of heat creeping up her neck. "I am not looking for a pet. I am looking at the woman who kept my bloodline alive when my entire army failed." Before Mila could respond, a heavy, urgent knock echoed against the oak doors. Scott's demeanor shifted instantly. The tender, conflicted mate vanished, replaced once again by the icy, calculating monarch. "Enter." Chaol stepped into the room, his armor freshly wiped clean of blood, though his face was drawn and grim. He bowed low. "My king. The prince has eaten and is resting safely by the inner hearth, but there is a matter of urgent concern." "Speak," Scott commanded, his posture rigid. "We secured the perimeter, but one of the rogues survived the initial ambush at the den," Chaol reported, his eyes darting briefly to Mila before returning to the king. "We intercepted him trying to send a raven to the western ridge. We stopped the bird, but the rogue confessed, under duress. The Beta's armies are not just mobilizing. They are marching." Mila gasped, clutching the furs tighter around her. "Marching where? The Citadel?" "No," Scott said softly, his golden eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He looked out the frosted glass of the high tower window, staring into the raging blizzard. "They are marching here, to Windspire." Chaol nodded tightly. "The Beta knew you would retreat to the ancestral stronghold if you found the boy. He plans to trap you here before you can rally the Northern Lords. He brings an army of 3,000 men. We have 5 guards." The mathematics of the situation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating as a death sentence. 5 men against 3,000. Even an Alpha King could not survive those odds. "How long do we have?" Scott asked, his voice entirely devoid of panic. It was a terrifying, eerie calm, with the blizzard slowing their heavy artillery. 2 days, Chaol replied. "Perhaps 3. Send out the ravens. All of them," Scott ordered, stepping away from the window. "Command the Northern Lords to rally their banners and ride for Windspire immediately. Tell them their king calls. Tell them their prince lives." "Yes, sire." Chaol bowed and quickly exited, leaving the heavy doors to click shut behind him. Mila felt the blood drain from her face. The safety she had felt just moments ago in the warmth of the fire evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold grip of survival panic. She threw the heavy furs off her legs and forced herself to stand. Her ribs screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain, walking unsteadily toward Scott. "We have to run," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "We can take Leo into the deep tunnel networks. The Western Beta doesn't know the mountains like I do. We can hide." "We are done hiding," Scott interrupted, turning to face her. The sheer authority radiating from him pinned her feet to the floor. "I am the king of the North. I will not cower in the dirt while a traitor marches on my ancestral home." "It's suicide," Mila argued, stepping closer, tilting her head back to look him in the eye. The Omega instinct to submit was entirely overridden by her fierce need to protect the pup she had raised. 3,000 men, Scott. They will slaughter you. And then they will slaughter Leo." The use of his given name sent a visible jolt through him. His golden eyes flared, pupils blowing wide. In a blur of motion, he closed the distance between them, his large hands gripping her shoulders, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to hold her completely still. "They will break themselves against these walls," Scott promised, his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her lips. "I will drown them in their own blood before I let a single blade touch you or my son. Do you hear me?" Mila's breath hitched. She could feel the violent, terrifying power simmering beneath his skin. He meant every word. He would tear the world apart to keep them safe. "You cannot fight an army alone," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a sudden, terrifying ache in her chest. "I am not alone," Scott murmured. He slowly slid one hand from her shoulder to cup the back of her neck, his thumb resting over her erratic pulse. The true strength of an alpha is not in his claws, Mila. It is in what he fights for. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest gently against hers. The contact was electric, a grounding wire in the center of a storm. Mila closed her eyes, surrendering to the overwhelming sensation of his nearness, inhaling the intoxicating scent of ozone and ancient stone. For a moment, the impending war, the blizzard, and the impossible odds faded into nothingness. There was only the heat of his skin and the steady, thrumming pull of destiny binding them together. Suddenly, a low, haunting sound echoed through the thick stone walls of Windspire. It wasn't the howl of the wind, nor was it the warning horn of an enemy army. It was a deep, resonant rumble, vibrating up from the very bedrock of the fortress, shaking the dust from the obsidian ceiling. Scott's eyes snapped open, glowing a brilliant, blinding gold. He stepped back from Mila, staring down at the stone floor as if he could see straight through the mountain. The deep vaults, Scott breathed, shock completely erasing the alpha stoicism from his face. Something has awakened. The vibration beneath their feet intensified. A steady, rhythmic thrumming that felt remarkably like a colossal heartbeat trapped within the mountain's core. Mila gripped the edge of the heavy wooden bedpost to steady herself. The air in the king's chamber grew suddenly dense, carrying a strange, metallic scent like rain striking hot iron, mixed with an undercurrent of crushed moonflowers. It was a scent that commanded absolute reverence. Scott didn't hesitate. He grabbed his broadsword from the heavy oak table and strode toward the door. "Stay here," he ordered over his shoulder. "Not a chance." Mila shot back, the defiance slipping past her lips before she could check it. She grabbed a thick, woolen shawl, wrapping it tightly over her threadbare tunic. "If the fortress is collapsing, I am not being crushed in a tower while Leo is down below." Scott paused in the doorway, the golden fire in his eyes battling with exasperation. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched upward in a fleeting, grim smile. "Stubborn Omega," he muttered. He didn't argue further. Instead, he reached out, his massive hand securely engulfing hers, and pulled her into the dark corridor. They descended the spiraling obsidian staircase 2 steps at a time. By the time they reached the ground floor, Kale and the remaining guards were already gathered near the great inner hearth, forming a protective ring around Leo. The boy looked terrified, his milky eyes darting frantically toward the floor beneath him. "Father?" Leo's small voice cracked, the word halting Scott in his tracks. It was the first time the pup had used the title. "I am here." "Little wolf," Scott answered, his tone instantly softening. He knelt beside the boy, resting a heavy hand on his shoulder. "What do you hear?" "Singing," Leo whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the massive iron-bound door at the far end of the hall, a door that had been sealed under a layer of frost and rust for centuries. "The stones are singing. They want the Omega." Every eye in the room shifted to Mila. She swallowed hard, feeling the crushing weight of their stares. Scott rose, his protective stance widening. He walked toward the iron-bound door. As he approached, the frost coating the metal began to hiss and steam, melting rapidly into puddles on the floor. Without touching the handle, the heavy door groaned, the ancient tumblers inside clicking with a deafening sequence of snaps. It swung inward, revealing a descending stairwell cloaked in absolute darkness. "Kale, guard the boy with your life," Scott commanded, drawing his sword. He looked back at Mila, extending his free hand. "Walk behind me." They plunged into the dark. The descent was long, the air growing colder and staler with every step, but the humming vibration grew so intense it rattled Mila's teeth. Suddenly, the narrow stairwell opened into a cavernous, subterranean amphitheater. It wasn't a dungeon or a tomb. It was a sanctuary. Luminescent blue moss crawled up the jagged stone walls, casting a spectral, ethereal glow over the room. In the center lay a circular stone dais, intricately carved with runes that predated the written language of their world. But it wasn't the runes that made Mila's breath catch. Hovering directly above the dais was a dense, swirling mist of pure silver light. It pulsed with a tangible, sentient energy. "The First Pax Ward," Scott whispered, lowering his sword. "It's a legend. They say the first Alpha King bound the spirit of the mountain to the fortress to protect the bloodline. but it hasn't awakened in 1,000 years. As Mila stepped into the cavern, the silver mist reacted violently. It surged forward, swirling around her in a blinding cyclone of light. Scott roared, surging forward to grab her. But the magic repelled him, throwing the massive Alpha backward onto the stone floor with an invisible, devastating force. "Scott!" Mila screamed, reaching for him, but the silver light cocooned her entirely. The air grew shockingly warm, the scent of moonflowers intensified, drowning out the dampness of the cave. And then, a voice echoed inside Mila's mind, not a sound, but a profound, ancient feeling. The balance is restored. Mila squeezed her eyes shut. What balance? She thought, her pulse racing. The Alpha is the shield. The Omega is the heart. The entity communicated, the words resonating in her very marrow. For centuries, the kings have ruled with teeth and iron, forgetting the foundation of the pack. You, who bled in the snow for a pup not of your body. You, who stood against the king's wrath with nothing but a wooden spear. You carry the true strength of the Luna. The silver mist began to sink into Mila's skin, leaving behind a profound, terrifying warmth that settled deep in her chest. The siege comes. The voice faded, growing faint. Unite the blood and the heart, or the mountain falls. The light vanished. Mila gasped, collapsing onto her hands and knees on the cold stone dais. The humming stopped. Scott was instantly at her side, his hands frantically searching her face, her arms checking for injuries. "Mila? Are you hurt? What did it do?" Mila looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide and trembling. "It's not a weapon, Scott. It's a lock." She placed a hand over his racing heart. "And we are the key." Before Scott could process her words, a dull, earth-shattering boom echoed from far above them. Dust rained from the cavern ceiling. The Western Beta's army had arrived, and they had brought siege engines. The iron gates of Windspire screamed under the assault. Boom! The battering ram struck again, the impact sending violent tremors through the high-vaulted ceilings of the courtyard. Scott stood at the center of the hall, his broadsword gleaming in the erratic torchlight. Beside him stood Kale and the 4 remaining royal guards, their wolves bleeding through their human features, claws extended, eyes flashing amber, teeth bared in feral snarls. 6 men against 3,000. They won't break the gate easily, but the hinges are ancient. Kale shouted over the din, wiping a smear of soot from his forehead. When it falls, they will flood the courtyard. "Let them," Scott growled, the vibration of his alpha dominance filling the massive space. "We hold the choke point. Nobody reaches the inner keep. Nobody touches the prince." Up in the high gallery, looking down upon the courtyard, Mila gripped the stone balustrade until her knuckles turned white. Leo was tucked safely beneath her arm, his hands covering his ears against the deafening strikes of the battering ram. "Unite the blood and the heart," the ancient voice echoed in her mind. She knew what she had to do, but the sheer terror of it paralyzed her. To unite meant to fully accept the mate bond. It meant intertwining her soul with the most powerful, lethal alpha in existence. It meant giving up the solitary freedom she had fought so bitterly to maintain. Boom. A massive splintering crack echoed through the courtyard. The center of the left iron gate buckled inward, revealing the swirling blizzard outside and the roaring horde of the Western Beta's forces. "Hold the line!" Scott roared. The gates finally gave way with a screech of tearing metal. The enemy poured in a tidal wave of heavily armored men and massive, shifting rogue wolves. It was a slaughter. Scott didn't just fight. He became a force of nature. He waded into the sea of enemies, his broadsword cleaving through armor and bone with terrifying ease. When his blade shattered against a heavy shield, he didn't falter. He dropped the hilt, and mid-stride, his body erupted. The massive, midnight black wolf hit the front line with the force of a landslide. His jaws snapped limbs like twigs. His massive paws crushed heavily armored chests. He fought with a desperate, feral savagery, anchoring himself at the base of the stairs leading to the inner keep. Kale and the guards fought brilliantly at his flanks, but the sheer mathematics of the battle were impossible. For every enemy they felled, 3 more took their place. Mila watched in horror as a heavy spear grazed Kale's shoulder, sending the guard dropping to one knee. Scott lunged to cover him, exposing his own flank. A rogue wolf, the size of a bear, slammed its full weight into the king, sending Scott crashing into the stone pillars. Blood stained the midnight fur of the king's wolf. He struggled to rise, a dark, wet stain spreading across his ribcage. "No!" Mila screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. The primal Omega instinct, the deepest, most ancient urge to heal and protect her pack, finally shattered the walls she had built around her heart. She didn't think about freedom. She didn't think about the crown. She only saw the man who had looked at her with pure reverence, bleeding out on the cold stone floor. "Stay here, Leo," Mila commanded, her voice suddenly echoing with a strange harmonic resonance. She turned and ran down the spiraling stairs. As her boots hit the courtyard floor, she didn't grab a weapon. Instead, she closed her eyes and completely reached out to the tether in her soul. She grabbed the mate bond and pulled. "I am yours." She surrendered into the bond. "And you are mine." The reaction was instantaneous. A blinding shockwave of pure silver and gold light erupted from Mila's body, radiating outward in a massive, visible dome. The temperature in the courtyard plummeted, the air suddenly smelling overwhelmingly of dark pine, ozone, and wild mint. The fighting stopped completely. The invading wolves whined, dropping their weapons and covering their ears as the ancient magic of Windspire, channeled through the newly bonded True Luna, hit them with the physical force of a hurricane. The silence in the courtyard was absolute, broken only by the howling wind outside the ruined gates. The silver and gold light continued to pulse from Mila, casting long, ethereal shadows across the blood-stained stone. Every enemy soldier, every rogue wolf, was suddenly forced to their knees. The oppressive, pacifying weight of the Omega aura, amplified 1,000 times by the ancient ward of the first pack, pressed them to the floor. They couldn't lift their swords. They couldn't bare their teeth. The bloodlust was violently stripped from their minds, replaced by a suffocating urge to submit. In the center of the courtyard, the massive black wolf slowly pushed himself to his feet. Scott's golden eyes were fixed on Mila. The mate bond between them was a physical, roaring inferno. His wounds were still bleeding, but the pain was entirely eclipsed by the staggering, divine power of his true mate. The crowd of subjugated soldiers parted as a single figure struggled to remain standing, the Beta of the Western Ridge. He was a heavily scarred man with a cruel jaw and eyes burning with bitter hatred. He leaned heavily on his battle axe, fighting the crushing weight of Mila's aura. "Witchcraft," the Beta spat, blood dripping from his lips. "She is an Omega, a lowly breeder. She cannot hold this power." Scott shifted. The massive wolf dissolved back into the towering, blood-soaked form of the king. He stood fully erect, his broad chest heaving, his golden eyes locked onto the traitor who had orchestrated the murder of his queen and the blinding of his son. Mila stepped forward, moving until she was standing directly at Scott's side. She didn't cower behind him. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the Alpha King, the silver light emanating from her wrapped around Scott's massive frame, merging with his golden aura, creating a terrifying, beautiful harmony of power. "She is the Luna of the North." Scott's voice boomed, amplified by the magic of the stone, rattling the remaining glass in the high tower windows. "And she is the heart of this mountain," the Beta snarled, raising his axe with a final, desperate burst of adrenaline. He lunged toward them. Scott didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even flinch. He simply raised his hand. The combined, synchronized dominance of the bonded Alpha and Omega struck the Beta like a physical wall. The traitor froze mid-stride, his eyes widening in sheer terror as his own wolf was violently crushed into submission by the overwhelming superiority of their united auras. The heavy battle axe slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor. The Beta fell to his knees, his forehead pressing into the dirt and blood of the courtyard, completely broken. "Treason," Scott decreed, his voice devoid of mercy, cold as the winter wind, "is punishable by ash." Kael, having recovered his footing, stepped forward without a word. With a single, brutal swing of his broadsword, the Beta of the Western Ridge was silenced forever. The remaining army of 3,000 men stayed perfectly still, their heads bowed, exposing their necks to the new Luna and the true king. The rebellion was over before it had truly begun. Scott turned to Mila. He ignored the kneeling army, ignored his own bleeding wounds. He dropped to one knee before her, right there in the bloodied courtyard. He took her small, trembling hand in his massive, dirt-caked palms and pressed a desperate, reverent kiss to her knuckles. "You saved us," he murmured, his voice cracking with exhaustion and profound emotion. Mila sank to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, burying her face into his shoulder. She inhaled the scent of ozone and pine, letting the reality of survival finally wash over her. "We saved each other," she whispered back, the silver light slowly fading into a soft, permanent glow within her hazel eyes. Winter's brutal grip eventually surrendered to the soft thaw of spring. The Blackwood Mountains wept melting snow, feeding the rushing rivers below Windspire. On the high balcony, Mila stood bathed in sunlight, no longer wrapped in fraying canvas, but draped in the rich, deep blues of the northern court. Beside her, Leo laughed, tracing the carved stonework of the parapet with confident hands, his scars no longer a mark of tragedy, but of survival. Scott wrapped his heavy arms around Mila from behind, pulling her flush against his chest. His chin rested on the crown of her head, his golden eyes scanning the peaceful horizon. She leaned back into his solid warmth, listening to the steady, unified beat of their hearts. An Omega from the shadows and an Alpha crowned in blood. Together, they had defied the laws of the realm, proving that true power wasn't found in absolute dominance, but in the perfect, unyielding balance of a bonded heart. If you felt the chill of the winter wind and the heat of Scott and Mila's undeniable bond, please like, share, and subscribe for more epic, cinematic romance stories. Let us know in the comments what kind of shifter story you'd love to see next.